Vikings are often portrayed as brave seafarers and fearless warriors, yet this heroic image frequently overshadows the darker aspects of their culture. These darker sides include iron rings permanently welded to captives' necks, blood oaths sworn over the bodies of fallen enemies, and marriage ceremonies conducted directly on fresh battlefields. Conquered women found themselves bound by sacred rituals that rendered their servitude indissoluble, with legal procedures becoming instruments of systematic terror. What is truth and what is fiction in these accounts? What is substantiated by runic contracts and unmarked graves? These ceremonies were not mere barbaric customs, but actual legal documents carved in stone. Archaeological findings from settlements in conquered territories confirm this. Vikings did not merely seize women as spoils of war, they forced them into religious marriages that erased their identities and stripped them of any hope of freedom. In the lands of the Danelaw, where the great Viking army swept through Northumbria with fire and sword, every victory was followed by a standard procedure: seizure of land and enslavement of the population. However, a distinct approach was applied to women. Iron neck rings, hammered on, while hot blood ceremonies performed over enemy burial sites, and marriage contracts carved on runestones, all were integral parts of this system. Vikings did not just conquer territories, they produced wives. These neck rings were not ornamental. Archaeological excavations of mass graves reveal iron collars welded shut, devoid of any clasps or mechanisms for removal. Chemical analysis indicates the metal was intentionally heated before installation. Vikings branded conquered women like cattle, affixing marks of ownership that declared possession and eliminated any possibility of escape. Icelandic legal codes preserve the details of these horrifying ceremonies. The Gragas law describes the requirements for blood marriage, stating that conquered women were compelled to swear oaths over the fresh corpses of enemies. Battlefield blood was mixed with sacred mead, and runic contracts permanently bound the women to their Viking husbands. This was legal slavery, disguised as a divine marriage. The timing of these ceremonies was critical. Blood marriages were performed within hours of victory, before enemy reinforcements could arrive and before the conquered population could organize resistance. Vikings understood that speed eliminated any chance of salvation. It was an immediate ceremony, an immediate establishment of ownership, and an immediate destruction of the former identity. Archaeological excavations in York attest to the industrial scale of these atrocities. Sites for mass weddings were located adjacent to battlefield cemeteries, and stone circles facilitated the simultaneous conduct of numerous ceremonies. This provided evidence of systematic processing. Vikings operated marriage factories that transformed conquered women into legal property within days of military victory. The demands of the oath completely obliterated the former identity. Conquered women were forced to publicly renounce their families, utter sworn statements rejecting their previous gods, and make blood promises to serve their Viking husbands until death. These ceremonies severed all ties with their past lives, legally transforming the woman into Norman property. Contemporary chronicles describe the psychological warfare waged at the time. Saxon women were forced to marry Viking raiders who had killed their fathers and brothers, while Irish captives were married to Norman warriors over the graves of their children. Vikings meticulously designed ceremonies to maximize trauma while simultaneously establishing legal ownership. The blood component served multiple purposes. Enemy blood, collected during battlefield killings, was mixed with sacred substances during marriage ceremonies. Conquered women were compelled to drink this mixture while taking oaths. Vikings forced wives to consume the blood of their own people as a wedding ritual. The legal framework ensured permanent ownership. Marriage contracts, carved on runestones in the presence of Norman communities, were recorded in settlement law codes. These ceremonies created documentation that prevented subsequent claims of freedom. It was legal slavery, disguised as a religious marriage. Specialized tools facilitated the ceremonies: iron neck rings forged to specific patterns, brands for marking married women, and stone hammers for welding the collars. Archaeological finds indicate the existence of standardized equipment for the mass processing of marriages. Settlement patterns point to the systematic implementation of this practice. Blood marriage sites were located in every major Viking-conquered territory, and standardized ceremony locations were found near battlefield burial sites. All of this attests to a coordinated application of this policy across conquered territories. Vikings institutionalized forced marriages as a policy of conquest. The Viking practice of forced marriage emerges as a deliberate policy of conquest. Eyewitness accounts from that era vividly depict post-traumatic stress disorder in conquered women who desperately tried to avoid participating in humiliating ceremonies, even resorting to suicide. Any escape attempt was brutally suppressed by a system of total surveillance and public condemnation. Vikings skillfully constructed social institutions where slavery, veiled by marital bonds, was maintained through collective responsibility. The economic rationale behind blood marriage made it a highly profitable enterprise. Married women became a source of free labor, and children born from these forced unions automatically became Norman property. Land inheritance rights were established through marital rights, further solidifying the economic dominance of the conquerors. Vikings meticulously designed rituals and ceremonies aimed at extracting long-term economic benefit from the subjugated population. Archaeological findings, particularly the analysis of skeletal remains, attest to the physical suffering caused by wearing neck rings. Compression of vertebrae under the weight of the iron collar, scars from constant restriction of movement, all provide undeniable evidence. Skeletons bear traces of systematic physical marking, akin to brands of ownership. Vikings left indelible physical marks on the bodies of conquered women, confirming their dominion. Religious dogmas served as a convenient justification for forced marriages, providing them with legal protection. Sacred oaths nullified all previous legal obligations, and the divine blessing supposedly bestowed upon a marriage of conquest removed all moral responsibility from the invaders. Vikings skillfully used spiritual beliefs as a weapon to justify systematic enslavement. Runic inscriptions have preserved details of marriage contracts, meticulously defining terms of ownership, property rights over wives and future children, and legal obligations for the labor and reproduction of conquered women. Vikings documented forced marriages with meticulous commercial precision, transforming human fates into commodities. Ceremony protocols that have survived to this day attest to clearly regulated procedures. The timing on the battlefield, the wording of oaths, the prescribed language, the requirements for witnesses, all were strictly observed to give legal force to the act. Vikings standardized forced marriages, transforming them into a meticulously elaborated ritual. Contemporary chronicles tell of resistance attempts and their tragic consequences. Women who refused to participate in the ceremony faced immediate execution, and communities harboring potential brides suffered collective punishment. Vikings suppressed any resistance through systematic terror. Neck ring manufacturing technologies were constantly refined. More reliable welding methods ensured unbreakable attachment, religious symbols were incorporated into collar designs, and identification marks indicated the husband's identity. Vikings developed specialized equipment for marital slavery, demonstrating their cynical approach to the issue. Archaeological excavations of settlements allow us to assess the scale of forced marriage programs. Burial sites where hundreds of women rest, their bones marred by traces of neck rings, and mass graves adjacent to marriage ceremony locations all attest to the systematic application of this practice in conquered territories. Legal documentation solidified slavery on a permanent basis. Runic contracts transferred property rights from the conqueror to the husband. Written agreements stripped women of legal personality, and carefully drafted documents precluded any future claims of freedom by the subjugated population or external powers. Psychological preparation for the ceremonies began long before they took place. Isolation from family, forced learning of Norman customs, systematic suppression of will through controlled starvation and violence, all broke resistance and prepared conquered women for participation in the ritual. Contemporary reports indicate the widespread knowledge of blood marriage practices outside Scandinavia. Frankish chroniclers describe forced marriage as an integral part of conquest policy. Saxon records detail systematic marital slavery, and Irish annals recount bloody ceremonies performed over graves on battlefields. Integration into settlements ensured continuous control over conquered women. Marital obligations demanding incessant labor, public surveillance preventing escape, and social structures punishing aid to married captives all created a system where slavery through marriage was maintained by collective responsibility. Archaeological analysis of marriage ceremony sites reveals evidence of mass bride processing. Stone circles capable of accommodating dozens of simultaneous ceremonies, battlefields adjacent to marriage structures, all indicate the coordinated application of this practice during major military campaigns. Economic benefits served as a powerful incentive for the systematic implementation of forced marriage. The free labor of married captives, inheritance of property through marriage by conquest, and the birth of children to expand the Norman population all transformed blood marriage into an economic institution, generating long-term wealth from conquered territories. The legal framework eliminated any possibility of liberation. Marriage contracts nullified all previous legal obligations, religious oaths created a spiritual bond, and societal coercion deprived conquered women of any hope of external assistance. Vikings devised legal traps that made freedom impossible. Vikings used religious beliefs to justify systematic enslavement, creating systems that rendered freedom impossible. Contemporary eyewitness accounts paint a picture of the horrifying consequences of these ceremonies. Conquered women exhibited symptoms characteristic of severe psychological trauma. Participation in forced marriage led to complete personality changes, and long-term mental health consequences plagued victims throughout their captivity. Religious integration served as a spiritual justification for these atrocities. Sacred oaths created a divine obligation. Religious ceremonies eliminated moral objections, and spiritual bonding superseded secular law. Thus, Vikings utilized religious beliefs to normalize systematic enslavement. Archaeological data from specialized tools attest to Viking technological sophistication. Improved neckring designs ensured permanent attachment, advanced welding equipment increased ceremony efficiency, and standardized measurements guaranteed collar fitting. Vikings developed industrial-level technology for marital slavery. Documentation systems preserved evidence of the systematic implementation of this practice. Runic records tracked the number of marriage ceremonies. Legal contracts specified terms of ownership, and settlement records monitored populations of married captives. Vikings maintained detailed documentation of their marital slavery programs. Community participation contributed to the cultural acceptance of forced marriage. The Norman population observed the ceremonies as a routine procedure of conquest. Children grew up witnessing blood marriage as standard practice, leading to social integration that normalized systematic enslavement through religious ceremonies. Contemporary chronicles describe the long-term consequences for the conquered population. Communities lost entire female populations due to forced marriage, leading to cultural destruction through systematic deprivation of reproductive capacity. Generational trauma affected conquered territories for decades. Technological innovations enhanced ceremony efficiency. Vikings developed mass processing capabilities for multiple simultaneous marriages, improved restraint systems for managing resistant captives, and advanced documentation methods for recording legal ownership. They continually refined their marital slavery systems. Archaeological excavations reveal evidence of resistance and its horrific consequences. Sites of mass executions for women who refused to participate in the ceremony. Archaeological data on systematic killings for marriage refusal, and locations of communal punishments for populations that harbored marriage candidates. Law enforcement created permanent systems of ownership, marriage contracts that transferred property rights permanently, religious obligations that eliminated opportunities for freedom, and communal responsibility for preventing escape attempts. Vikings developed legal frameworks that made marital slavery irreversible. International trade created markets for married captives, export systems for selling women already bound by blood marriage, commercial networks that valued wives of conquest for their legal status, and international demand for captives who had already undergone marital slavery. Contemporary reports describe aspects of the psychological warfare waged by the Vikings. Forced marriages conducted over family graves to maximize trauma, ceremony timing designed to prevent escape attempts, and the public nature of blood marriage to terrorize the remaining population. The archaeology of settlements reveals the scale of this practice's systematic implementation. Marriage ceremony sites were located at every major Viking conquest site, indicating coordinated application across conquered territories. Mass processing facilities were designed to handle large populations of captives during marriage seasons. Preparatory facilities functioned as processing centers for transforming people into property, holding areas adjacent to battle sites where conquered women awaited ceremonial assignment. Standardized procedures for evaluating marriage candidates based on age, health, and level of resistance. Quality control systems that determined suitable husbands. Archaeological data from Dublin reveal specialized architecture for the mass processing of blood marriages. Underground chambers with drainage systems for ceremony preparation. Stone platforms designed for multiple captives to take oaths simultaneously. Acoustic features that amplified screams to terrorize the waiting population. Victim selection criteria prioritized psychological impact over simple demographics. Daughters of defeated nobles were chosen to maximize community trauma. Wives of slain enemy leaders were selected to demonstrate complete conquest. Religious women were targeted to dismantle spiritual resistance among the conquered population. Contemporary Frankish chronicles describe the international shock caused by the practice of blood marriages. Diplomatic protests from neighboring kingdoms regarding forced marriage policies, commercial boycotts of Norman traders known for their marital slavery, and Viking conquest methods became internationally notorious. Viking marriage rituals, as historical evidence shows, gained widespread international notoriety. Legal documents of the time reveal complex mechanisms for transferring property rights. Runic agreements meticulously detailed inheritance rights for offspring born from forced unions. Specific clauses outlined the transfer of conquered women's property to their new Viking husbands. A legal framework was established that completely precluded any future claims of freedom. Chemical analysis of neck adornments indicates deliberate design for permanent fixation. Iron alloys were specifically chosen for weld strength. Metal compositions resisted attempts at cutting or removal. Vikings developed restraint systems that made escape physically impossible. The timing synchronization of ceremonies required military precision. Marriage schedules were aligned with raiding seasons. Battlefield wedding sites were prepared in advance, even before the start of conquest campaigns. Logistic planning ensured the immediate performance of the ceremony right after military victory. Archaeological studies of skeletal remains indicate systematic malnutrition during periods of marriage preparation. Deliberate starvation was used to weaken resistance before marriage ceremonies. Controlled feeding schedules were designed to maintain appearance while simultaneously suppressing physical strength. Vikings honed starvation into an effective tool of subjugation. The religious component served as a spiritual justification for marriages of conquest. Sacred oaths were sworn, invoking Norman gods as witnesses to forced unions. Ceremonial elements transformed enslavement into a divine obligation. Religious rhetoric eliminated moral objections to systematic marital slavery. Eyewitness accounts survive detailing the psychological conditioning methods used during ceremony preparation. Isolation techniques were employed to sever social ties with family and community. Systematic humiliation aimed to destroy self-esteem and the will to resist. Cultural norm training was conducted, preparing women for integration into Norman society. Economic calculations spurred the systematic implementation of forced marriage programs. Cost-benefit analyses demonstrated the long-term profitability of forced marriage compared to conventional slavery. The labor productivity of married captives was assessed against traditional slaves. Vikings applied a commercial approach to their policies of conquest marriages. Archaeological excavations at Stamford Bridge reveal the evolution of ceremonies over time. Early burials indicate crude methods of containment, while later ones demonstrate technological advancements in systems of permanent subjugation. There was a systematic refinement of marital slavery practices over decades. Mechanisms of societal coercion ensured constant control over married captives. Neighborhood surveillance systems, social obligations involving the Norse population in maintaining marital slavery, and collective responsibility for preventing escape attempts. Contemporary chronicles describe specialized raiding tactics developed to capture potential brides. Military strategies prioritized the capture, rather than the killing, of the female population during attacks. Coordinated roundups aimed to maximize the number of young women available for forced marriage ceremonies. Pharmaceutical knowledge was also employed in these marriage ceremonies. Narcotic, psychoactive substances were administered during the taking of vows to ensure submission. Chemical compounds induced memory lapses related to the trauma of the ceremony. Combinations of drugs facilitated the acceptance of forced marriage obligations. Archaeological data from settlements reveals the scale of reproductive control exerted through forced marriages. Genetic analysis indicates systematic breeding programs utilizing subjugated women. Population genetics provides evidence of the planned production of offspring from these coerced unions. The Vikings weaponized reproduction through marriages resulting from conquest. Enforcement practices created permanent documentation of ownership. Stone carvings recorded marriage contracts for future generations. Runic inscriptions established property rights over subjugated women and their future children, and legal frameworks made marital slavery hereditary. Contemporary reports attest to the impact of forced marriage practices on international trade. Diplomatic friction arose with kingdoms that refused to recognize forced marriage contracts. Commercial complications emerged with trading partners who objected to marital slavery. Viking policies thus created international legal conflicts. Ceremony protocols included specific trauma-inducing elements designed for the complete suppression of resistance. This involved forced participation in rituals that violated prior religious beliefs, requirements for oaths that compelled women to publicly renounce their families, and bloody ceremonies that intensified psychological terror. Archaeological investigations of mass burial sites located near marriage ceremony venues reveal horrifying evidence of systematic killings, with victims being those who refused to participate in these rites. Particular cruelty was shown towards women who dared to resist forced marriage. The discovered burial patterns indicate collective punishment inflicted upon entire communities that attempted to shelter potential brides from their predetermined fate. Over time, technological advancements only increased the efficiency of these monstrous ceremonies. The capacity for hundreds of marriages to be conducted simultaneously pointed to the mass scale of these atrocities. Containment systems became more sophisticated, allowing for the control of large groups of resisting captives. Documentation methods also evolved, enabling meticulous recording of the legal ownership of the subjugated population. Contemporary eyewitness accounts shed light on the tragic consequences that befell conquered communities. The systematic deprivation of women's reproductive capacity inflicted profound psychological trauma on the entire population. Cultural heritage was destroyed due to the forced integration of women into an alien Norse society. For generations, the conquered territories bore the mark of loss, having been deprived of a significant portion of their female population. The religious calendar played a sinister role in coordinating the timing of these bloody marriages with sacred holidays. Seasonal ceremonies, which combined the celebration of conquest with mass marriages, were transformed into religious rites where forced unions were presented as a form of divine worship. The very concept of sacred time was perverted, serving to justify conquest marriages as supposedly aligning with the spiritual needs of the Norse. Archaeological findings of specialized items used in wedding ceremonies indicate that these events had an industrial character. The mass production of standard-sized neck rings, ceremonial platforms designed for dozens of simultaneous marriages, and standardized equipment for branding married women captured through conquest all attest to the scale of the tragedy. The psychological warfare unleashed by the invaders was not limited to individual ceremonies, but aimed at terrorizing entire communities. The public nature of the bloody marriages was intended to demonstrate complete and unconditional conquest. Ceremony schedules were arranged to ensure maximum attendance of witnesses from the subjugated population, and the strategic placement of marriage sites was designed to amplify the psychological impact. Preserved chronicles describe the training systems for personnel involved in the ceremonies. Specialized priests conducted mass marriage rituals, legal scribes documented conquest marriage contracts, and military coordinators managed the large-scale logistics of the ceremonies. The Vikings transformed conquest marriages into a profession of sorts, requiring formal training. Integration into settlements was accompanied by the systematic destruction of former identity. Conquered wives were forced to change their names to erase their ancestral memory. Cultural, education programs replaced indigenous customs with Norse practices, and linguistic requirements prohibited communication in native languages. Archaeological excavations reveal the existence of resistance networks among married captives, despite the harsh containment systems. Hidden communication methods between conquered wives, coordinated suicide attempts to escape marital slavery, and underground aid networks that tried to help married women flee, all speak to an unbreakable will for freedom. Economic analysis shows that marital slavery was more profitable than traditional methods of conquest. Studies were conducted comparing the productivity of forced wives with that of purchased slaves, evaluating the reproductive value of children born from conquest marriages, and examining the economic efficiency of processing marriages versus alternative control methods. Contemporary reports indicate that the practice of conquest marriages negatively impacted the international reputation of the Vikings and their diplomatic relations. Neighboring kingdoms refused marriage alliances with Norse leaders known for their bloody deeds. Christian states imposed trade restrictions in protest against the practice of conquest marriages. The evolution of the legal framework demonstrates a systematic refinement of marital slavery legislation. Earlier runic codes contained only basic provisions regarding property. Later, more complex legal norms were developed to close loopholes in conquest marriage contracts. The continuous refinement of legal frameworks made escape virtually impossible. Archaeological analysis of bone chemical composition reveals long-term health consequences caused by the constant wearing of neck rings. Skeletal deformation due to the continuous pressure of iron collars and signs of nutrient deficiency indicative of systematic abuse of married captives all serve as physical evidence of suffering that lasted for decades. Preserved documentation of the ceremonies attest to the systematic implementation of this practice in conquered territories. Databases of marriage contracts containing information on thousands of forced unions, settlement records, tracking populations of married captives across generations, and legal archives demonstrating the industrial scale of marital slavery operations. all bear witness to the magnitude of the tragedy. Historical evidence sheds light on the horrifying realities of marital slavery during the Viking Age, revealing systematic operations that deprived women of their freedom and dignity. Modern research highlights the psychological impact on Viking children who witnessed conquest marriages. The younger generation of Norse grew up perceiving forced unions as a commonplace occurrence accompanying wars of conquest. Children participated in the preparation of wedding ceremonies as part of their cultural education. Such practices contributed to the entrenchment of marital slavery, passing it down through generations. Technological advancements of the time served to create reliable identification systems for enslaved wives. Branding methods were used to unequivocally determine a woman's belonging to a specific conqueror husband. Tattoos indicated a captive's affiliation with a particular settlement, and physical mutilations made escape and subsequent disguise impossible. Archaeological finds in burial sites reveal the tragic fate of conquered women. Analysis of burial rituals indicates the systematic killing of captives when they were no longer useful to their enslavers. Objects discovered in the graves suggest that these women were treated as property, not as family members. This data confirms that bloody marriage often ended with the disposal of the victim. A Saxon chronicler's account from 85 AD, relating to the vicinity of York, speaks of the long-term consequences of marital slavery. Women forced to wear iron collars were deprived even of the right to utter their birth names. Archaeological excavations near Viking settlements confirm this tragic picture. Mass graves showing resistance to marriage ceremonies, fragments of neck rings with welding marks, runic marriage contracts carved in stone, and skeletal remains bearing traces of a decade of wearing an iron collar. The Vikings did not merely coerce women into marriage. They created a comprehensive system of legal slavery in which conquered women lost their identity, becoming the property of the Norse, bound by sacred oaths that precluded any possibility of liberation or return to their former lives. Doomed to wander like shadows until their usefulness expired, and they were consigned to oblivion in nameless graves.